Hey guys, welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, here to give you another lecture, and for this lecture we're going to be continuing our examination of the home front during the United States Civil War. And with that said, I'd like to dive right into the action. Now, to begin with, during the course of the United States Civil War, many slaves in the Confederate States took it upon themselves to escape and leave their plantations. This was done either when their masters took flight and became refugees, or when the United States Army came through. Whenever United States troops were near, slaves would take off. Now, the presence of escaped slaves created new concerns for the United States that had to be addressed. And this was not done uniformly, but piecemeal. Eventually, a system was established where the escaped slaves, now known as contraband slaves, or contraband of war, were placed in specific camps with soldiers to guard them. They were allotted food, clothing, and missionary groups actually came through to visit them to establish schools and churches for them. The United States very quickly organized the contraband into units that performed the necessary non-combat duties to keep an army in the field operating. Now, in theory, the contraband slaves were free and had to be paid a wage, but often they were given assignments and put to work doing what the army needed them to do anyway, without any input from the slaves. Now, contraband slaves were also put to work on abandoned plantations, growing the cash crop that were sent back to the free state mills, particularly the textile mills, to fuel the United States economy. Many speculators from the United States who were interested in turning only a profit tried to make as much money as possible off of the plantations, using contraband slaves as cheap or easy labor. Now, some plantation owners signed loyalty pledges in order to keep possession of their land. They, along with the profiteers from the free states, were not concerned with the plight or the well-being of the contraband slaves working on their plantation. And this was further compounded by Nathan Banks. In Louisiana and Mississippi, Nathan Banks held control for the United States. He held it as the War Department. And he issued a statement stating that labor was a public duty. He also stated, and just to give you some perspective of this, Banks was a Democrat. Didn't care, no regard for the plight of African Americans. He would later seek Democratic support for a political office, but at this point he was a commander in command in the West, and he's giving it an order stating that labor is a public duty. He stated that idleness, vagrancies, they were crimes. He forced the contraband slaves to sign up for work in his jurisdiction. They had to sign up with an employer for 1 year. In return, they would be given wages, food, and housing. They were paid. The ways they were paid turned out to be really underhanded. They really ended up receiving the same wages they got when they were slaves. They were paid, but deductions were taken out for clothing, medical care, and other surcharges. In many ways, they were reduced right back to being slaves, and they couldn't leave because of the vagrancy law, and they couldn't refuse to do anything because of the idleness laws or idleness statutes that were proclaimed by Banks. They ended up working for room and board, which had I alluded to earlier, had I stated earlier, was to them not much different than slavery. Abolitionists cried foul, pointing out the exploitative nature of Banks' system, but it stood for a time. Now, not all contraband slaves fared poorly. Those who had technical skills were generally better off, just as those who had technical skills under the slave regimes were better off on the plantations. and they fared better than those who were strictly used as field hands. Contraband slaves on plantations overseen by the government also fared a little better than those who were on plantations overseen by speculators or by former slave owners. The situation got worse as the war went on. The healthier men of military age left the contraband camps to serve in the United States Army. This left older, infirm men, adolescent boys, women, young children, old women, left all of them to perform the full duties on a plantation. This, unsurprisingly, led to a very high, a shockingly high, really, mortality rate in the contraband camps, with about 25%, about 25% of the contraband slaves dying in those camps. Now, the major question confronted the United States government was whether or not to give the contraband slaves land. This would, in its proponents' eyes, alleviate the burden placed on others supervising the contraband slaves. Abolitionists, radical Republicans, contraband slaves, and free persons in the United States all lobbied for this. They all argued in favor of this, saying that land would give them the means to support themselves. By the end of the war, about a quarter of all the land under the United States military was being farmed or used, put to use by African Americans, independent of any sort of governing oversight. And most interestingly enough, they were settled on land formerly owned by Jefferson Davis. As a matter of fact, a number of former slaves, a number of Jefferson Davis's former slaves were resettled on his former personal property. African Americans spoke up with ardent vigor in favor of being given land. It was the best option, the best solution to the problem. It was seen as the very best way to ease the community into the next chapter of their lives. Now, the great obstacle to this was that many in the United States opposed handing over land to contraband slaves. For one, speculators, and these speculators are also known as carpetbaggers. They wanted to exploit the land, and they wanted to maintain a large pool of cheap labor. They did not want to compete with African Americans. They did not want an independent class, a landed class of human farmers. They didn't want to have to compete with anything like that. They wanted laborers, and unfortunately, the split was normally 80-20 between speculators and contraband slaves, and as far as like land redistribution went. Now, Lincoln further added to the confusion by saying in 1862 that property could be seized, but only for the duration of the slave or of the previous owner's life, or the rebel owner's life, and not indefinitely. Now, this raised the question of whether or not African Americans who came into possession of land would be allowed to retain possession of that land after the owner's death. And to this, Lincoln later said in 1863 that any Confederate who took the oath of allegiance would have his property returned to him, his land property, not his slave property. In 1862, radical Republican George Washington Julian proposed a modified version of the Homestead Act, but this act would be specifically in effect for African Americans in the South. His bill proposed giving heads of household 40 to 80 acres of land. It would give them 40 to 80 acres of land. This bill failed in Congress. It failed to be passed by both houses. Congress instead opted to create what became known as the Freedmen's Bureau. And it is at this point that contraband slaves sort of get dropped from the vernacular, and freedmen, freedmen as opposed to freemen. Freemen were people who were free before the war. Freedmen were people who were freed after the war or during the war. and the freedmen sort of replace contraband slaves or contrabands. Freedmen's Bureau in 1865 is created by Congress instead of adopting a modified Homestead Act to be at work in the South for African Americans. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau could lease abandoned or confiscated land with an option to buy it after 3 years to freedmen. That was what the Freedmen's Bureau was entitled to do, was empowered to do. Now, onto the scene at this point comes William Tecumseh Sherman. Now, Sherman comes onto the scene, and we spoke about Sherman before, and Sherman's attitude towards African Americans. Now, he issued his own statement on land distribution, and it is ironic that Sherman, who was deeply racist and had little regard for the well-being of African Americans, issued perhaps the best field statement, Field Order 15, on African Americans, on freedmen and land. He mainly issued a statement to rid himself of the thousands of contrabands or freedmen that attached themselves to his field army. Sherman met with local African American leaders in Georgia. They expressed their desire for land, citing that with land they would be able to care for themselves and not have to follow his army. He said, "You have me and not have to follow my army." And on January 16th, 1865, he set aside a very large portion of the Georgia coastline, the Georgia Low Country, and the South Carolina Low Country for resettlement by freedmen, promising each 40 acres of land. Sherman granted them a possessory title until Congress made a final settlement. It is from this that Sherman got his nickname Moses within the African American community, and two, the cry of the 40 acres and a mule come from. Sherman's grant, Sherman 40 acres to African American small scale farmers, comes from this. They were able to the Field Act actually promised 40 acres and a mule, but it also said that that everything was temporary. It was only they only had the land until Congress made a final decision. Now, there were those who made consistent efforts from 1862 onwards to give African American equal rights in the United States. This was opposed by Democrats and conservative Republicans who wanted to gradually approach the topic. But abolitionist radical Republicans persisted, and eventually the key achievement of their efforts was the passage of the 3 civil rights or Civil War amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th, which were all added to the United States Constitution. Now, these amendments abolished slavery, granted equal protection, and enfranchised African American men. Now, we already touched bases on the 13th Amendment, but we're going to go over it again. Now, the election of 1864 gave the Republican Party massive majorities in the Senate and the House. The men who were elected would not take their seats until well into 1865, not until the fall, the winter of 1865. At this point, the 13th Amendment had been stalled in the House initially, but Lincoln threw his full support behind the act. He targeted, as I stated earlier, several lame duck congressmen to support passing the amendment. After the passage of the 13th Amendment in Congress, all of the states in the Republic, with the exception of New Jersey, Kentucky, and Delaware, quickly ratified the 13th Amendment. Returning former slave states also had to ratify the amendment, had the condition of their readmission into the Republic. The cancer that was slavery had finally been excised from the Republic, and the remaining slave states, new constitutional conventions were held, and new constitutions were put in place that outlawed slavery, and they all of the slave states, with the exception of Kentucky, adopted new constitutions. Kentucky refused to either abolish slavery or ratify the 13th Amendment. Now, the election of the new Congress marks a new era in race relations in the United States. For the first time, African Americans were allowed into the gallery of the Congress. They were invited to official White House functions. Other key legislation passed by the new Congress prohibited the exclusion of witnesses from federal courts on the basis of race, prohibiting segregation on the basis of race in the District of Columbia. It repealed, the Congress actually repealed an 1810 law prohibiting African Americans from carrying the mail. At the state level, a number of states went on to repeal their own state black laws. These were laws that discriminated against African Americans in a number of ways, including using public transportation and housing. Now, another key moment came in February of 1865 when Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase admitted John Rock, a lawyer. John Rock was a jack of all trades. He was a lawyer, he was a doctor, he was an educator, he was a lot of things. But John Rock was admitted before the United States Supreme Court. It is a noteworthy achievement because less than 10 years before, Rock, along with every other African American, was denied eligibility for citizenship by the United States Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision. Now, that does not mean that these list of accomplishments of good things that I just ran through, they do not mean that everything was sunshine and roses for the African American community. They still could not vote at this time. And a virulent kind of racism still permeated United States society. But these were real gains. Real gains had been made. And with that being said, we're going to break here. I'm going to get a drink of water. And when we come back, we'll wrap things up with our survey of the home front. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture. And I will see you guys next time.